Outside of Winslow, Arizona, lies a series of natural caverns below the sandstone that has intrigued tourists and historians for decades. It's in these caverns that Native American artifacts have been found dating as far back as 1050 AD. And while this is fascinating to archaeologists, that's not so much why this area is so well known. Just off of a small, nondescript exit on Interstate 40 are the ruins of a ghost town that sits silent in the middle of the desert. A dusty, sagebrush-strewn town that has quite a tale to tell. Welcome to Two Guns, Arizona. There are so many legends surrounding Two Guns and the nearby cave system that it's difficult to distinguish fact from fiction. All of the information we have about the area has come from two sources: a book published in 1968 by a man who actually worked in Two Guns at the Trading Post, and an article written in 1967. Little remains of the actual town. It's still an attraction of a different sort, though only a shell of its previous life. So why has this touristy hotspot long been deserted? Well, enter the legend of the Curse of Two Guns. Because of the artifacts found in the caverns, we know that Native Americans used the location for many centuries. But the story of Two Guns is actually a lot more recent, originating in 1878. The legend tells the story of an Apache tribe that had raided some Navajo villages, slaughtering men, women, and children. But in one settlement, they captured 3 young Navajo women and took them hostage. When the Navajo chiefs got word of the slaughter, they dispatched a war party of 25 braves to avenge the deaths of the Navajos and to rescue the captured women. After tracking the Apaches to the area around Diablo Canyon, the trail went cold. The Navajos had set up blocks in all directions, and still no sign of the Apaches. In a hasty move, the Apaches raided another nearby Navajo settlement, alerting the Navajo braves that they were still in the area. The Navajos focused on the canyon and sent 2 braves to scout it. The braves, in their efforts to locate the Apaches, hadn't found any evidence of their presence, until randomly, they felt a blast of hot air coming from a pile of disturbed rock. The Apaches and their entire raiding party were hiding out in the caverns below. The Navajos quickly mobilized and built a fire of dry sagebrush and driftwood at the entrance of the cavern to try to smoke out the Apaches. The distressed Apaches were desperate to put out the flames and used all of their water to do so. When that didn't work, they slit the throats of their horses and tried to douse the flames with the blood. They then used the horse carcasses to blockade the entrance. In all the chaos, one Apache escaped and went to the Navajos to beg for his life. The Navajos were prepared to spare the man until they asked about the 3 female hostages. Learning that the women had been killed sent the Navajos into a rage, and they opened fire into the cavern and then set it ablaze. 42 Apaches were killed. Once the fire had died down, the Navajos entered the cavern and looted the remains of the Apaches, taking all of their valuables. Apaches never again entered the caverns and tried to warn settlers of the awful things that happened there. Naturally, the settlers ignored the Apaches. Arizona would soon have its share of settlers coming through the region. The first settlers were the Oldfields, who initiated development of the area. They opened up a small store about 3 miles south of Diablo Canyon and called it the Canyon Lodge. The next major settler who arrived was Ed Randolph. He set up his store next to the cave where the Apaches were slaughtered. In 1915, a bridge was built across Diablo Canyon. Then in 1922, a World War I veteran named Earl Cundiff bought the property from Ed Randolph. Cundiff also opened a store near the cave. The location that Cundiff and his wife Louise chose for their store was to become a future stop on the famed Route 66. By the end of the year, the Cundiffs had added gas pumps and a restaurant. They named the town Two Guns, and all seemed to be going quite well for the newly established town, but not for long. In 1925, a well-educated swindler named Harry Miller caught wind of the Cundiff's success. He managed to talk Earl Cundiff into leasing a section of the homestead to him for 10 years. The lease, complete with loosely written clauses, would prove to be a great source of conflict between the two men in times to come. Harry Miller was a publicist known for having a garish and most unpleasant demeanor. He called himself Harry Two Guns and Chief Crazy Thunder because he claimed to be of Apache descent. He saw the legend of the Apache Death Cave as a business opportunity and decided to cash in. He utilized Hopi labor to clear the caves of Apache remains and repurpose the caverns into dwellings. He and his wife, with help from the Hopi Indians, also built a zoo, hosting common and uncommon critters native to Arizona. The zoo featured everything from Gila monsters to coral snakes to cougars. He commercialized ancient caves by building fake ruins and installing lights to make it more tourist-friendly. Down in the caves, he even built a soda stand. The area came to be known as Mystery Cave. The Apache skulls and bones that were recovered were sold as souvenirs in the gift shop. In 1926, Miller's trading post was robbed by a band of drifters, forcing Miller to approach Earl Cundiff and propose an alteration to the lease agreement. An argument broke out between Cundiff and Miller fatally shot Cundiff. Somehow, Miller was ultimately acquitted of the murder. But as it turns out, Miller's streak of bad luck was just beginning. Over the next couple of years, Miller was mauled in 2 separate incidents by cougars. He was bitten by a poisonous Gila monster, which caused a severe infection and made his entire arm swell. Then in 1929, Miller's trading post caught fire and burned to the ground. At this point, Louise Cundiff placed a legal claim on the land, but Miller countersued with the barefaced lie that he was actually on the property first. After a legal battle costing up to $15,000, Louise Cundiff won and was awarded the land. In 1930, Miller left Arizona to avoid any further lawsuits and set up another shop across the New Mexico border. Old habits are hard to break, and he set up another zoo with fake ruins and a phony cave he called Cave of the Seven Devils. He remained there until his death in 1952. Meanwhile, back in Two Guns, Route 66 had been rerouted to the other side of the canyon. Louise Cundiff had remarried Philip Hirsch, and they rebuilt everything, including the zoo on the opposite side of the canyon, to preserve their business. But Louise Cundiff moved away and opened another Texaco service station on a different section of Route 66. Two Guns was sold off in the 1950s, but was resold and leased numerous times in the coming years. Finally, in the 1960s, Two Guns was sold to Ben Dreher. He revived the town by opening a major complex that included a service station, a restaurant, a motel, a tavern, a gift shop, and even a post office. He even reopened the zoo with reptile exhibits. Dreher built tourist trails around the property. One of them even led to the Apache Death Cave. Interstate 40 was nearly finished, and Two Guns was even getting its own exit, number 230. It seemed that Two Guns had been saved. Then, Dreher started exploring the caves to see if he could hold tours there. In 1971, a fire broke out and burned the entire complex to the ground. Since then, several attempts have been made to rebuild the town of Two Guns, but all attempts have failed. More recently, in 1992, a man from Quartzsite, Arizona, bought the town property. His name was Howard Armstrong, and he would suffer a fatal stroke in 1995. A caretaker of the property, who preserved the town ruins and buildings, Jimmy Solinger, committed suicide in 2000. It had been reported that actor Russell Crowe bought the property formerly known as Two Guns in 2011. Supposedly, he was going to shoot a remake of Westworld there. However, this claim has not been corroborated in any way, and there has not yet been a remake filmed. But in spite of fires and deaths around the property, there have been many more paranormal experiences in the area. Settlers near Two Guns have heard disembodied groans and ghostly footsteps outside their houses. Two Guns was even compared to Shakespeare's Hamlet. Plenty of murder, madness, and superstition. That section of Route 66 has had a very disproportionate number of accidents through the years. And all that remains today are the ruins of a gutted gas station and the zoo. You can still visit the site, but beware of crumbling trails, bridges, and ramps. Rattlesnakes are a major hazard in the area as well, and there is also still a fair amount of barbed wire lying around. In a post from a very recent visitor, the area has sadly undergone serious decay in the last few years, primarily from vandalism. But is the history of Two Guns, Arizona, and the Apache Death Cave even real? Some say no. It's a work of sheer fiction from a prolific writer in the Western genre. Back in 1950, the property of Two Guns was sold to S.I. Richardson. He ran the trading post with his son and daughter-in-law. His son Gladwell began writing a book called Two Guns, Arizona, after he and his wife Millie had been running the depot for years. This book was published in 1968. From this book, many stories came out, such as the one about Billy the Kid and his gang using the cave. It laid out in detail many of the things that we know about the history of the area. More information was written in a magazine article by Maurice Kildare in 1967. Maurice Kildare is one of Gladwell Richardson's many pseudonyms. So how reliable is Gladwell Richardson? Well, here's an account of his very colorful life before coming to Two Guns. On April 23, 1923, Officer J.S. Sullivan of the Arizona Eastern Railroad arrested a young man in a boxcar in Phoenix. There was nothing but vagrancy expected, until a search at the police station uncovered a diary with a handwritten account of murdering a rabbi in a San Francisco hotel room, along with how he deserted the Navy. Richardson claimed it was a story he was writing based on accounts he'd seen in the newspapers. The police believed him, but the next day, Richardson confessed to the whole thing. He was then accused of murder. In court, he said that the incident happened on April 3, 1923, 20 days before he was arrested. He claimed that he had deserted the Navy while on leave in San Francisco. He had been approached by a man claiming to be a rabbi and asked to meet later at the Gates Hotel on Fillmore Street. The rabbi, Alfred G. Laffey, awakened him in the middle of the night and attacked him. Richardson had no choice but to defend himself from this crazed man. On May 15, 1923, a grand jury refused to indict him, claiming it was indeed self-defense. That should have closed the case, but it didn't. On June 29, 1923, the Supreme Court confirmed the grand jury's decision and dismissed all charges, citing insufficient evidence. Even though he was acquitted of murder, he still had to be prosecuted for military desertion. He allegedly reported to a naval station at Yerba Buena Island, where he remained on duty until 1924, when he was recalled to active duty. He served in Arizona, Indiana, and the South Pacific. He went on to become an organizer for the Flagstaff Indian Powwow and to write over 300 fictional works. He ran his father's trading post in Two Guns until he sold it to Ida Fern Jacobs Rawlinson, who in turn sold it to Ben Dreher. Gladwell even dedicated his 1968 book on Two Guns to Dreher, hoping it would give Dreher the good fortune to revive the town. So was the whole thing an elaborate hoax from a work of fiction? All the deaths, the fires, the tragedy that occurred around the ghost town of Two Guns, Arizona. One may never really know. The Las Vegas Strip is the site of some of the most iconic buildings in America. And near the top of that list is the Luxor Hotel and Casino. The complex, with its 350-foot Black Pyramid, is among the largest hotels in the world, with 4,407 rooms and 2,000 slot machines under its unmistakable angled roof. An Egyptian obelisk and a replica of the Sphinx guard its entrance, and from its peak, the strongest beam of light in the world fires into the sky. But despite its brilliance, the Luxor has a dark history. Since it opened in 1993, the storied complex has played host to a shocking number of bizarre deaths. Deaths that were sometimes kept secret, lest the bad news frighten off the droves of tourists. So many deaths that some have called the casino cursed. Reports of deaths at the site first came about during the hotel's construction, when the rumored deaths of several workers on the project were deliberately kept from the headlines. But the stories didn't die there. In the years that followed, visitors would report sightings of ghostly figures throughout the hotel. Apparitions were seen often in the dark corners and dim basement tunnels of the Luxor's Nile River boat ride. The hotel has since demolished the attraction. Only 3 years after the hotel was completed, the Luxor experienced its first public death. In 1996, a woman fell from the 26th floor atrium balcony of the hotel. To the horror of onlookers, her body landed on an old buffet table. The body struck with such force that it broke apart on impact, rendering the victim unidentifiable. Stories of her being a suicidal sex worker circulated, though nobody really knows the reason for her death. It's said that her ghost now haunts the 26th floor, and the buffet has since been replaced by a food court. More mysterious deaths followed, with another guest falling to his death from the 10th floor. Again, the reason for his fall is unknown. In October of 1997, a 16-year-old prostitute named Sarah Gruber was strangled to death by a hotel guest that she had picked up in the bar. A decade later, a terrifying event happened in 2007, when a young casino worker went out to his car and noticed a plastic cup, upside down, sitting on his car roof. When he lifted it up, it exploded, immediately killing the worker. Casino operations continued without interruption. 2 men were later tried and convicted for planting the bomb, but no motive was ever found. In 2010, a famous incident involving mixed martial arts fighter Jason Sindelar made headlines. Sindelar was involved in a public altercation with his girlfriend at a party. He was drunk and was making a scene. A UNLV football player named Demario Reynolds, who was also a guest, asked Sindelar to leave the party. Sindelar then tried to grab his girlfriend by the throat and hit her. Reynolds restrained him with a bear hug until the man calmed down. When Reynolds released him, Sindelar started throwing punches and then stormed out of the party. But a short time later, he would return. He confronted Reynolds and slammed his fist into the man's face with such power that Reynolds collapsed to the floor and never regained consciousness. A court later ruled that Reynolds died from an overdose and not from the blow by Sindelar. Just 2 years later, an airman from nearby Nellis Air Force Base got into a fight with another airman in the lobby of the Luxor. One man shoved the other back against an open elevator door, and there was no car in the shaft. The victim plummeted 25 feet down the empty shaft to the basement. Sources say he died from the fall. Later that same year, Luxor's water supply was stricken by Legionnaire's disease, resulting in the deaths of multiple hotel guests. These strange and violent deaths have generated a steady stream of ghost stories about the property, and some of the spirits have become familiar faces. On the 12th floor, guests report being asleep in their room, only to wake up startled, fighting for air, and fending off the sensation of being choked. Others have said they felt a phantom hand sweep across their face in the darkness, while others have reported seeing the ghost of a mysterious blonde woman hovering over them. The unsettling blonde apparition is among the most frequently seen in the hotel. However, nobody seems to know who she is. Many ghosts have been attributed to the special exhibit that opened at Luxor in 2008. The Titanic exhibition is an ambitious museum that includes reproductions of rooms from the doomed ship. Visitors claim to have seen a shadowy figure standing on the brilliant replica of the Titanic's grand staircase. The museum also includes over 250 actual artifacts recovered from the sea floor, many of them personal items belonging to the ill-fated passengers. Luxor visitors often report what they believe to be the spirits of the owners drifting around the lost artifacts. Elsewhere, the ghost of the great ship's lookout, Frederick Fleet, has frequently been seen on the exhibit's promenade deck, gazing into the darkness for survivors of the tragic voyage. The notorious history of the property certainly begs the question as to why the Luxor has attracted such bad karma. And there is no shortage of theories. Most often, these terrible events are blamed on the structure of the hotel itself and the occult associations with pyramids. Named for the temple complex in the Egyptian city of Thebes, Luxor was originally designed to be a family-friendly slice of ancient Egypt on the Vegas Strip. But the original pyramids were burial shrines to great pharaohs. They had religious significance, and many think that the casino is cursed for not respecting the integrity of the architecture it impersonates. Some even claim that ancient Egyptians built sphinxes on either side of their great pyramids, one to guard the east entrance and one to guard the west. The Luxor has only one sphinx facing east, so some say it's not fully protected from evil spirits. Or perhaps it's because Luxor is on the western side of the Las Vegas Strip. The Egyptian land of the dead was on the western side of the Nile. Some blame these tragedies on the suppressed story of the original construction workers who supposedly died on the job as the pyramid was built. Of course, the display of personal artifacts from the Titanic's passengers aren't helping the situation either. Still, others suggest the first few deaths in the hotel inspired mobsters to use the Luxor as a place to knock off their own victims, figuring more deaths wouldn't get so much attention. Seers and prognosticators all have theories involving mysterious beings and forces of the unknown. But it's also possible that these strange Luxor deaths are simply due to something that the residents of Las Vegas know is all too real: a run of bad luck. In a sleepy community in rural south-central Kentucky lies a gem of the natural world. Mammoth Cave, outside Cave City, Kentucky, was officially recorded as the longest cave system in the world when 65 miles of caves were mapped and surveyed in 1969. In 2021, there were officially 420 miles of surveyed and mapped caves in the Mammoth Cave system. Mammoth Cave National Park covers an area of 53,000 acres and has been designated a World Heritage Site, as well as an International Biosphere Reserve. It's also one of the most studied karst, or cave regions, in the world. It supports different ecosystems, like terrestrial forests, grasslands, caves, and aquatic waterways, such as above and below ground rivers, upland swamps, and creeks. Visitors to the park can enjoy cave tours, ranger-led programs, camping, hiking, canoeing, and horseback riding. But the natural beauty of the park is not the only reason millions of tourists flock to the cave annually. Mammoth Cave is also said to be haunted. The limestone in the area was formed between the Mississippian and Pennsylvanian periods. Large, warm, shallow seas teeming with sea creatures covered the area at the time. Once the seas dried, however, they left behind the limestone deposits from ancient coral reefs that have since been carved into caves from the raw power of running water. The caves were formed many eons before the prehistoric people first discovered them just 12,000 years ago. However, we don't have any recorded history of mankind's presence in the caves until about 5,000 years ago, when hunters and gatherers from the late Archaic and early woodland periods began exploring the caves. By 1200 BC, these prehistoric people were mining gypsum, epsomite, and other minerals from the walls of the caves, and they did this by scraping the minerals with mussel shells into containers. Evidence of this mining can still be seen in parts of the caves today. These early spelunkers explored the upper 3 levels of the Mammoth Cave system and are credited with discovering the first 19 miles. But these early explorers were not the only people to trek the caves. By the 19th century, the caves were more thoroughly explored and mined. During the War of 1812, enslaved African Americans were sent into the caves to mine saltpeter for the production of gunpowder. After the war, Mammoth Cave became a tourist attraction. And once tourists began trampling around in substantial numbers, the mummified corpse of a woman was found in the cave. Officials had no idea who she was, but estimated that she was about 1,000 years old, and judging by the way her body was preserved and how it was adorned, she was very well respected. Since the 1800s, 4 more bodies had been discovered in the caves, many of which were originally on display in the early years of tourism. The same African American slaves responsible for mining saltpeter became so familiar with the passages within, they would ultimately become the first tour guides. As more and more tourists flocked to the region, hotels and lodgings sprung up in the area to accommodate the droves. In 1839, Dr. John Croghan of Louisville heard stories of how, quote, refreshed tourists and guides felt after being in the caves for a while. Animals did not decay inside the caves either. Dr. Croghan had tuberculosis, which was not well understood at the time, but he thought that the moist air and constant temperature inside the caves could prove to be restorative and therapeutic for tuberculosis patients. He purchased the cave property for around $10,000. By the winter of 1842, he had convinced 16 patients with tuberculosis to go into the caves to try to cure their disease. Slaves built small huts for sleeping quarters and an experimental hospital treatment facility deep inside the cave. There was an open area where some of the cooking would take place. Oddly enough, some tourists were still exploring the caves during this time. Tourists would report seeing gaunt figures slowly walking around corners and often reported hearing coughing and wheezing echoing throughout the caves. During the experimental tuberculosis treatment, one patient got fed up and left the caves altogether. At first, the experiment seemed promising, so Croghan began working on plans to build a hotel inside the cave for tuberculosis patients. However, as the months wore on, patients' lungs deteriorated in the damp conditions. Chambers were constantly filled with smoke and ash from the lard oil they used for light and fires. Most meals were prepared by slaves and brought into the cave. By the spring of 1843, after 5 months inside the cave, 5 patients had died of their disease, and Dr. Croghan decided to end the experiment. All 16 participants eventually succumbed to their illness, with Dr. Croghan passing away in 1849. This experiment became called the finest example of authentic 19th century quackery. After Dr. Croghan's failed TB hospital, the land changed hands a few times, but the tourists kept coming. By the early 1900s, even African Americans began coming to see the caves as well. A former tour guide, Matt Bransford, and his wife Zemi opened up the Bransford Summer Resort for African Americans. This was the first time in Mammoth Cave history that African American tourists could enjoy the cave with the same comforts as white tourists. The Bransford Summer Resort was a 14-room hotel that remained in operation until the Bransfords sold the property for $3,000 in 1934. This was to make way for the newly appointed Mammoth Cave National Park. Between 1933 and 1942, the Civilian Conservation Corps, or CCC, worked throughout the new park to prepare it for the tourists, including building new roads, planting trees, creating trails, etc. There were 4 camps of the CCC. Camp number 1 was entirely made up of African Americans, who worked mostly inside the caves, improving the trails that are still in use today. The CCC was disbanded in 1942 when Congress diverted the money to fight World War II. But the history of Mammoth Cave wouldn't be complete without mention of the Kentucky Cave Wars of the 1920s. Mammoth Cave was one of the most profitable tourist attractions in the area because of its accessibility and proximity to lodging. However, Floyd Collins owned the nearby Crystal Cave. Crystal Cave was hard to find, and Collins was losing money hand over fist to Mammoth Cave. Collins decided to try to excavate an entrance to a more accessible cave, Sand Cave, to compete. During this shoddy excavation, a huge boulder came loose and pinned Collins' leg.
This triggered one of the nation's first morbid media frenzies. Newspapers and radio carried constant updates on Collins' condition. Tourists began flocking to see the entrapped Collins. Some wished him well, some prayed for him, and some just came to gawk. Wanting to cash in on the hysteria, hamburger and hot dog stands popped up to feed the hungry tourists. They even started selling souvenirs. All of this craziness was going on while rescuers tried in vain to release Collins' leg from the boulder. And if that wasn't bad enough, another cave-in occurred and separated Collins from the rescuers. Rescuers could not get medical treatment to him, and after a harrowing 2 weeks, Collins finally died from exposure. Collins' body was eventually recovered and interred in the family cemetery. Later on, Collins' father, who was still alive, sold the property to a local dentist. The dentist somehow managed to get permission to exhume Collins' body. He placed the body in a glass-lidded coffin and put it at the entrance to Sand Cave so tourists could see the decaying corpse of one of the world's best cave explorers. Then, the body went missing. Nobody knew who actually stole it, but it was rumored to be a rival cave owner, jealous of the publicity drawn to Collins' body. Fortunately, the body was found a few days later, although it was missing a leg. The body was placed back into the coffin and was still on display up until Mammoth Cave National Park bought Sand Cave in 1961 and closed it to tourism. Sand Cave was later found to be connected to Mammoth Cave. Oddly enough, Collins was not properly buried until 1989. Most of the hauntings inside the cave are attributed to Collins. As for hauntings and ghostly sightings, Floyd Collins is thought to be the main specter seen and felt by so many tourists over the years. There are also ghosts of African Americans seen throughout the caves. Tourists have reported the ghost of a Caucasian woman with dark hair, tied up in a bun, seen throughout the park itself. While African Americans were mining saltpeter, they often held church services in a large cave room now called the Methodist Church. Tourists have reported hearing voices and singing near that room. There have been over 150 documented paranormal events throughout the park and caves, making Mammoth Cave the most haunted natural wonder in the world. People have seen ghosts, heard voices, been touched, hit, pulled on, and even caught when stumbling. The reports are not just from tourists either. Many park employees and guides have had experiences as well. With nearly 5,000 years of human history, it's no wonder that Mammoth Cave is thought to be haunted. Paranormal researchers believe that limestone and water are conduits for energy required for the manifestation of apparitions. Over the many years of mining and slavery, residual energy is thought to imprint on the rock itself. And there has to be some leftover energy from Dr. Krogan's underground tuberculosis hospital. With such an interesting and varied history, Mammoth Cave will surely be surprising visitors for many generations to come.
In the city of St. Louis sits the stately, historic Lemp Mansion, an icon of 19th century wealth and privilege. It's now used as an office building, but a century ago, it was the center of life for one of St. Louis's most celebrated families, famous for their success and affluence, infamous for a harrowing succession of suicides. The opulent house became the home of Johann Adam Lemp, who first arrived in St. Louis from Germany in 1838. He started out in the grocery business, but eventually made the switch to brewing lager beer. His brewery and saloon, called the Western Brewing Company, was located near what is now the landmark Gateway Arch. His lavish mansion functioned as both the family home and the headquarters of the young company. Western Brewing became an incredible success, growing to become one of the top 10 beer companies in America and one of the top 20 in the world. And for decades, the Lemp family was one of the premier families in St. Louis. But an unending wave of personal horrors would eventually tear apart the prosperous family. By 1901, William J. Lemp, Adam's son, had long been president of Western Brewing. Tragically, that year, his favorite son, Frederick, died of heart failure. He was only 28 years old and was the heir apparent to the company and the massive family fortune. The shock of the death had a permanent impact on William, who slowly receded from public life. Within a few years of his son's death, William had become a despondent recluse. Then, only 3 years later, on New Year's Day of 1904, William's best friend, Frederick Pabst, another beer magnate, also died. William's depression worsened, and he started to take less interest in running his company. In the following weeks, he continued to show up for work, but he was anxious and uneasy with daily responsibilities. He became increasingly disengaged, and both his mental and physical health were rapidly declining. Only 6 weeks after his friend's passing, William succumbed to despair. He went into his office on the second floor of the mansion, picked up a .38 caliber Smith & Wesson, and shot himself in the head. His adult son, William Jr., heard the shot and raced up the stairs to see what had happened. The door was locked, so he had to kick it in, only to discover his father's body. A few months later, William Lemp Jr. became the new president of what was renamed the William Lemp Brewing Company. It continued to be successful, and William came into a huge inheritance. He and his fashionable wife Lillian, who also came from a wealthy background, indulged in a life of luxury and opulence. With a staff of servants, rooms full of clothing, lavish horse-drawn carriages, and a growing art collection, they were the picture of Victorian ostentation. Married in 1899, William and Lillian had a son, William Lemp III, the following year. But motherhood did not interfere with Lillian's active society life. A classic trophy wife, the beautiful socialite became known as the Lavender Lady because she was constantly seen in that color. She was also a spendthrift, and when William Jr. began to tire of her and started having affairs, he kept her busy by requiring that she shop and spend $1,000 a day. If she failed, she'd be cut off entirely. William Jr. lived a double life, as a driven corporate executive by day and a wildcat hellion by night. He staged decadent parties in the natural caves located adjacent to the mansion's basement. He stocked them full of call girls for his friends, and they reveled in debauchery and beer as they lounged around his private swimming pool and bowling alley. But it was not to last. According to legend, William Jr.'s affair with a prostitute, or with one of the servant women, produced an illegitimate son. His birth was never documented, but he was born with Down syndrome, a misunderstood condition at the time. He was cruelly nicknamed the monkey-faced boy, and his image-conscious family was so embarrassed by him that they kept him in isolation throughout his childhood in the attic of the Lemp Mansion. In 1909, William Jr. divorced Lillian, which precipitated a huge citywide scandal. Fascinated crowds heard stories of violence, drunkenness, and cruelty. When it was over, Lillian retained custody of their child, though she almost lost the case because of a photograph showing her with a cigarette. Her last day in court was the only day she did not wear lavender. She wore black. After the divorce, Lillian stepped back from the social scene while William Jr. continued to run the brewery. But by this time, the company was facing stiff competition. William's mother died right in the middle of his marital battles and his company's declining profits. Despite this, in 1911, the Lemp Mansion was completely renovated with some rooms repurposed for company offices. Their fortunes got worse during World War I, and the condition of the brewery deteriorated. William Jr. exiled himself to a country home he built in 1915 along the Merrimack River. He took on a second wife, Ellie, who was the daughter of a fellow St. Louis brewer. Then, Prohibition hit in 1920, destroying the beer industry. That year, William's sister, Elsa, herself a wealthy heiress, shot herself over her tumultuous marriage. This drove William Jr. into a deep depression. Like his father before him, he became increasingly anxious and unpredictable. He withdrew from public view, and his health began to decline. Then, in December of 1922, William Jr. shot himself with a .38 caliber, this time in the heart. The tragedy took place in the same room as William Sr.'s violent suicide. William Jr. was interred in a crypt right above the one for his late sister. The family continued to occupy the Lemp Mansion through the Roaring '20s and the Great Depression. But in 1943, 42-year-old William III suddenly died of a heart attack. His brother Charles took over and renovated the mansion, eliminating the offices and converting the building back into a residence. He continued to live there with the monkey-faced boy nephew and 2 servants. As he aged, William III became a germaphobe and developed an obsessive-compulsive disorder of always wearing gloves. Then, still in his 30s, Charles's handicapped nephew died in the Lemp Mansion, where he had been kept his entire life, adding to the tragic karma that had gripped the house. Not long after, Charles took his dog, a Doberman Pinscher, down into the basement of the building and shot it. Shortly after that, in May of 1949, one of the house staff went up the stairs to Charles's room on the 2nd floor and discovered his boss's body, dead of a gunshot, with a .38 caliber Army Colt revolver still in his hand. The one surviving brother, Edwin Lemp, who had avoided the drama of his family, died peacefully many years later in 1970. But his last wish was to burn all the family documents, artifacts, and artworks in a huge bonfire. In the 1950s, the Lemp Mansion was converted into a boarding house. But the condition of the building had deteriorated into something like a flophouse, and soon tenants began telling ghost stories about the once extravagant manor. As the building was renovated yet again in 1975, becoming a hotel and restaurant, construction workers would tell of accounts of bizarre sounds, disappearing tools, and mysterious figures wafting through the dark. It felt like they were being watched. Many of them were so frightened, they never returned to finish the work. Restaurant staff would report strange, fleeting apparitions, voices coming out of nowhere and cocktail glasses hurling themselves across the dining room. Doors would lock themselves, lights would blink on and off, and the piano at the bar would play with no one there. These events were attributed to the tragic past of the Lemp family. They'd happen most often on the stairway, in the attic, where the Down syndrome son was housed, and in the notorious caves connected to the basement, which the hotel staff called the Gates of Hell. The attic is said to be haunted by the ghost of the monkey-faced boy, whose face was reported being seen, peering outside a small 3rd-floor window. Others claim they've heard disembodied footsteps going up the main staircase, and a kicking sound at the door to William Lemp's office, where he died. Ghost investigators have tested the spirit presence in the mansion by setting toys in the attic in specific places, only to find them moved without explanation. A woman once reported a man leering at her over the shower stall. Some say it's the ghost of William Lemp Jr. To this day, guests at the mansion talk of ghostly footsteps, dark figures circling their bed at night, and gut-wrenching moments of chilling intensity. But the Lemp Mansion is very much still open for business. The western part of North Carolina is known as a wild and lush region with densely forested mountains, deep gorges,
raging rivers, and scenic beauty to be found nowhere else in the world. The hot pink and fuchsia rhododendron pop against the dark green pines and hardwood foliage. Waist-high ferns flourish on the pine needle-covered forest floor, and a smoky blue haze clings selfishly to the mountains and settles in the valleys. This is just outside the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. US Highway 74 slinks and slithers through the valleys and over the gaps from Murphy to Asheville. But it wasn't always there. The first economical route of transport through this rugged wilderness was the railroad. In the late 1820s, railroad construction began to boom in the South. It encompassed some of the most ambitious development projects to date. By 1860, the Southern Railroad network was one of the most extensive in the world. However, the larger tragedy is that most of it was built with slave labor. In fact, railroad companies became some of the largest owners of slaves in the South. Railroad companies bought and sold slaves with contracts and conditions of labor, complete with printed, complex bills of sale. These slaves were reported as human property via gains and losses to company stockholders, and were carefully accounted for in company ledgers. As early as 1844, Louisiana set a precedent for not only using slave labor, but also leasing out criminals for pay, which would allow criminals who were incarcerated to be leased out for work. The practice made money for the jails, the states, and the companies who leased them as nearly free labor. This would not gain widespread use, however, until after the Civil War ended and the slaves were freed under Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. Although the South's railroad network was extensive, it was not prepared to handle the amount of traffic brought forth by the Civil War. The gauges of the different lines were not standard, and the workmanship was shoddy at best. Not only heavy freight and traffic caused widespread damage to the Southern railways, but the Union Army was notorious for destroying portions of the network. Union soldiers led by General Sherman reportedly took up the rails, heated them, and wrapped them around trees. This became affectionately known as Sherman's bow ties. Between the Union Army, no maintenance, and extremely heavy usage, the Southern railways were in absolute shambles by the end of the war. While the railroads were critical in cutting off Confederate supply trains, they became even more critical in the reconstruction of the South. The US government understood the importance of restoring these railroads in order to connect the economical hubs of the North with the farms and products from the South. This new endeavor opened up many new job opportunities for Southerners who no longer had farms or plantations. Industries like lumber, steel, coal, and iron became crucial to rebuilding the railways. Slowly, agricultural industries came back to life, as Southerners were once again able to sell their crops and products. Rebuilding the railroad did not come easily. Because there was no standard gauge or distance between the rails, engineers had to create one, 4 feet, 8.5 inches. By standardizing the gauge, the engineers could lay down track quickly and more efficiently. Another problem was labor. There simply weren't enough men willing to work on the railroads after the catastrophic losses during the war. And while the railroads were being rebuilt, there was still a great deal of resentment among the Southern states for the loss of the Confederacy, the freeing of the slaves, and the Northern intervention in the affairs of the South. While 4 million slaves were freed, Southern states still devised ways to circumvent their emancipation. One of these was called the Black Codes, a set of rules meant to restrict free movement among African Americans and to force them into employment. If any person, usually men, were accused and convicted of violating the Black Codes, they were sent to prison. Infractions could be anything and included petty crimes ranging from vagrancy to loitering. The sentences were often very harsh. Enter the birth of the American chain gang. Since the prisons and jails were now bursting at the seams with newly convicted African American men, the states decided to lease them out for labor. During the period of Reconstruction, convict leasing became widespread. Because the act of convict leasing was so lucrative, states leased prisoners to plantations and private corporations, like the Tennessee Coal and Iron Company and the Chattahoochee Brick Company. The lessees, or those hiring the prisoners, were responsible for clothing, housing, and food. To give an example of how much money could be made in 1898, 73% of Alabama's state revenue came from convict leasing. North Carolina finally prohibited the system of convict leasing in 1933. So what was life like for these leased criminals? By all accounts, life was a living hell. The work was very hard. Discipline was harsh. Food and shelter were barely adequate. There were swindlers at every corner looking to make a quick buck by whatever shady method they could find. The railroad camps were the worst. They had to work on mountains and in valleys. They had to build bridges and dig tunnels. The work was exhausting and very dangerous. By the 1870s, railroad construction was booming, and not just in the South. Prior to 1871, there were 45,000 miles of track laid. But between 1871 and 1900, there were 170,000 miles of track added. Congress authorized the construction of railroads that spanned the entire country, from the Atlantic to the Pacific Oceans, called the Pacific Railway Act of 1862. The first transcontinental railroad was finished on May 10, 1869. As railroads expanded to the westernmost part of the nation, other ethnic groups were working in the camps, including Chinese and Irish immigrants. As the railroads were being rebuilt in the South, nearby economies improved and eventually began to boom. In 1880, the new rails reached Asheville, North Carolina. The next year, workers started digging, filling, and blasting a 116-mile extension from Asheville to Murphy, called the Murphy Branch. Engineer Captain J.W. Wilson was the man responsible for undertaking this monumental task. Wilson and his men were challenged to construct an 836-foot-long tunnel outside of Dillsboro. Balsam Mountain was very steep and curvy, with gaping ravines. Once the rails were in place, they were laid at an elevation of 3,100 feet, making this the highest railway in the eastern United States. The tunnel, to be called the Cowee Tunnel, was located just west of Dillsboro and was intended to cut through a mountain, shortening the distance of the railroad instead of going around a huge meandering loop alongside the Tuckasegee River. The tunnel would blast through a mountain between the Tuckasegee River and the Laurel Branch. The Murphy Branch was built by leased convicts from the prison in Raleigh. The men worked at gunpoint and were shackled together. The actual railroad force varied from 150 to 500 workers. Many of these workers were veterans who had worked on the railroad for at least 3 years. They were possibly the same crew involved in building the tunnels at Swannanoa. They were under supervision of J.M. McMurray and E.B. Stamps. On the morning of December 30th, 1882, 30 prisoners, all shackled together, waited on the bank of the Tuckasegee River to be ferried across to work at the tunnel. The night before, however, it had rained and was below freezing. The boat had a fair amount of water and slush in it, but was still able to carry up to 50 men. While crossing the river, the water and slush from the rain began to shift. Thinking the boat was sinking, several of the prisoners panicked and quickly moved to the opposite end of the boat, causing it to capsize. People watched helplessly from the bank as the men were dumped into the frigid water. Because they were shackled together at their ankles, their efforts to swim away just entangled them into a hopeless, mangled mess. One by one, the men sank. Surprisingly, one of the men, Anderson Drake, managed to get loose and swim to shore. Drake supposedly rescued a guard by the name of Fleet Foster by pulling him out of the freezing water. Normally, this heroic act would have won him a pardon. However, Foster, embarrassed by being saved by one of the prisoners, would later plant his wallet in Drake's duffel bag. Instead of a pardon, Drake was sentenced to 10 lashes with a leather strap and 30 years of hard labor. The rest of the men who drowned were later pulled from the river. Nobody knows exactly where the 19 men were buried on January 1st, 1883. Most accounts claim that they were buried in a mass grave above the tunnel. But local oral history claims that there are 3 unmarked mass graves on a hillside near the tunnel. Further legend states that because of his harsh sentence of 30 years hard labor back with the railroad, Drake himself cursed the tunnel out of anger and despair. Local legend states that Cowee Tunnel has always been plagued by disaster. There were multiple cave-ins during construction. Water continues dripping from the ceiling to this day, and folklore states that it may be from the tears of the drowned men crying about being hastily buried in an unmarked mass grave above the tunnel. The interior is very dark, and a blind curve has been responsible for severe accidents and derailments in the past. As for the 19 men that perished, after remaining nameless for 130 years, all 19 men have now been identified by a Western North Carolina local, Gary Carden. An effort called the Going Home Project is currently underway to locate the remains, to identify each of them, to send them home to their living relatives, to be properly interred and to honor them. Carden interviewed residents and researched archives to discover that the bodies were in fact buried on a nearby hillside that was once a meadow in 1883. Although it is now covered in pine needles and thickets, the graves have been found and the search is underway for living relatives. Carden and the others involved also want to see a statue erected in downtown Dillsboro to honor the men who drowned. The Cowee Tunnel disaster highlighted not only the hazardous work involved in building railroads, but it also brought to life in glaring technicolor the horrors of the treatment of African Americans in our nation's history. A solemn reminder that ultimate prosperity for the United States came at the price of countless lives, leased and sold for mere pennies. My name is Scott, and thank you so much for watching. We are Mystery Syndicate. If you like what we do, please consider subscribing to our YouTube channel. Leave a comment and give this video a like. And to be notified when we post new videos, hit that notification bell. Also, check us out on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, and Patreon. And for exclusive merchandise, visit our website at www.mysterysyndicate.com. From all of us at Mystery Syndicate, thank you again. We sincerely appreciate your support.